You know Escobar. But he wasn't alone. Power like that needs a trigger man, and his name was El Mexicano, Pacho, Colombia. A speck of green swallowed by jungle. A place where time doesn't move forward. It just rots. No industry, no hope. Just stray dogs, machetes, and silence. The kind of place where the ground remembers every drop of blood and forgets every name. Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha was born here in 1947, the son of a mule driver. Poor wasn't the word. They were below poverty, living in mud, eating off borrowed time. No books, no teachers, no dreams. Just work, hunger, and the sound of gunfire in the distance. He didn't grow up with toys. He grew up with tools. A machete before age 10, bullets before age 12. What raised him wasn't family, it was need. Need to escape, need to matter, need to never feel powerless again. And in the stillness of the nights, around firelight and flies, he heard stories. About Mexico, about men who disappeared poor and came back rich, about routes through jungles that ended in stacks of dollars and bodies. He listened. He remembered. Because even at that age, Gacha wasn't dreaming of survival. He was dreaming of control. And when he left Pacho, he didn't just walk away from poverty. He walked toward war, toward cocaine, toward power, toward a throne built out of shadows. The 1970s and 80s in Colombia weren't just violent, they were apocalyptic. Every institution bought, every city bleeding, every deal written in gunpowder. He started moving shipments outside cartel channels, started forming his own alliances in Mexico, started planning his exit, not from crime, but from Pablo's shadow. He built fortified compounds in Tolu and the Magdalena Valley. No journalists, no outsiders, just guards, guns, and escape routes. Because El Mexicano knew what everyone else refused to admit. In this business, you either die fast from a bullet or slow from trust. And he would rather go out shooting it than be caught sleeping. By 1989, the empire was shaking. The Medellin cartel had declared war on the Colombian state, and the state had finally decided to fight back. Judges were bombed, candidates were executed, and the US turned its full attention south. They weren't just hunting traffickers anymore, they were hunting terrorists. Rodriguez Gacha was now Colombia's most dangerous man. Not because he was the richest, not because he was the most famous, but because he was the most unpredictable. He had burned too many bridges, made too many enemies. Even Escobar kept his distance. The walls were closing in. The DEA, Colombian intelligence, even whispers of betrayal within his own army. So Gacha did what he always did. He ran to the jungle. He brought his son, Freddy, a handful of loyal sicarios, and a convoy of armored trucks into the thick forests near Tolu. But the government had eyes in the sky. Satellite imagery, intercepted calls. They weren't chasing a myth anymore. They were closing in on a man. On December 15th, 1989, the jungle erupted. Colombian police and army units surrounded Gacha's hideout. A firefight broke out. Not a gun battle, a war zone. Bullets tore through the trees. Grenades shook the ground. Gacha, trapped with his son, refused to surrender. They tried to escape by boat. Didn't make it far. The military caught up, final stand. Father and son, side by side, shooting back against a nation. They were gunned down near the shoreline, their bodies riddled with bullets. No last speech, no trial, no cameras, just silence and the sound of the jungle swallowing a king. They say his body was so mutilated, the coroner couldn't count the wounds. And in that moment, the man who once built armies, who once terrified presidents, became just another corpse on a jungle floor. When Rodriguez Gacha died, the headlines barely lasted a week. The world had already chosen its villain, Pablo Escobar. He was the face on the news, the story the world could follow, but Gacha. He was the architect behind the curtain, the machine behind the myth. And when he fell, the world moved on. But the game didn't stop. The men Gacha trained, the routes he carved, the armies he armed, the blood he spilled, they didn't disappear, they multiplied. His death didn't dismantle the network. It decentralized it. And in that fragmentation, a darker, smarter generation rose. The paramilitaries he funded evolved into death squads. The smuggling corridors through Mexico, they became the lifeblood of future super cartels. He taught the world that cocaine wasn't just a product. It was a military strategy. That terror could be monetized, that governments could be bought or broken. And though his name faded from documentaries, and though he was buried without fanfare, his blueprint outlived him. In Mexico, they still whisper the nickname El Mexicano, the foreigner who wasn't foreign, the Colombian who knew Mexico better than most Mexicans. To some, he was a ghost. To others, a teacher. To the next generation of narcos, a prophet. Because in the underworld, you don't need a statue to be a legend. All you need is a story men still fear to tell. History remembers faces: Pablo, Chapo, Escobar, Guzman. They were loud, they were visible, they wanted to be seen. But Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, he didn't want to be famous. He wanted to be feared. He never gave interviews, never smiled for cameras. He didn't build a legacy, he built a system, one where blood paid the bills, where roads were paved with silence, where power wasn't worn, it was enforced. He was a trafficker, yes, but also a general, a financier, a warlord with a vision, cocaine as conquest, fear as diplomacy, Mexico as a battlefield. And long after his death, his blueprint remained, passed down, copied, perfected. Today, cartels operate like corporations. They move with drones, satellites, lawyers. They own cities, they control borders. But the roots of that machinery, the brutality, the logistics, the strategy, trace back to him, to the man who played second to none. Because Gacha didn't want the crown, he wanted the infrastructure behind it. And when it crumbled, he knew exactly how long it would take for someone else to rebuild it. Maybe that's why he smiled in that last photo, half limp on the jungle floor, bullets in his chest, his son beside him. Not because he lost, but because he knew he'd already won. Some men chase glory. Some men chase gold. But the deadliest of all just chase control. And while chaos consumed the nation, Rodriguez Gacha saw something no one else did. Opportunity. He started small. Smuggling emeralds, running errands for gangsters, a driver, a messenger, a nobody with sharp eyes and a steady hand. But Gacha didn't want a seat at the table. He wanted the table burned, flipped, and rebuilt in his name. In Medellin, he met a man with the same hunger. Pablo Escobar. One had charisma, the other had carnage. They didn't just click, they ignited. Together with the Ochoa brothers, they formed the Medellin cartel. Not a drug business, a narco-state. While Escobar handled smiles, speeches, and senators, Gacha handled the shadows. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't famous, but behind the scenes, he moved like a tactician. He mapped out smuggling routes through Central America, built infrastructure with military precision, turned towns into airstrips, turned airstrips into lifelines. He wasn't moving cocaine, he was moving power, and when rivals stood in the way, he didn't out-negotiate them. He erased them. Entire families wiped out overnight. Police chiefs found hanging from bridges. Judges assassinated in front of their homes. Gacha didn't see violence as a risk. He saw it as currency, something to be spent loudly, publicly, so no one would ever dare test him again. He wasn't Escobar's sidekick. He was his equal in blood, if not in fame. A general in a war no one dared to name. And a businessman who measured profit in kilograms and casualties. Because for Rodriguez Gacha, chaos wasn't something to escape, it was something to master. And he climbed through it not with luck, but with a plan. To understand how Rodriguez Gacha became El Mexicano, you have to understand what Mexico meant in the cocaine trade. Access, corridors, corruption, escape. It wasn't just a neighbor to Colombia. It was the gateway to the United States. And whoever controlled the Mexican pipeline controlled the flow of billions. Gacha knew this early. While others looked north and saw borders, he saw opportunity, a map, a maze, and he was determined to own every inch of it. He traveled to Mexico in the late 70s, not with fanfare, but with cash and bullets. He bribed border agents, recruited smugglers, made deals with emerging Mexican traffickers, men who would later become kings themselves. But back then, Gacha was the teacher. He showed them how to launder money, how to bury product under concrete, how to move cocaine not in kilos, but in tons. He brought them airplanes, he brought them routes, he brought them violence, and Mexico responded. The cartels there didn't just accept him, they feared him, they followed him. And soon Gacha wasn't just a Colombian drug lord, he became El Mexicano. The man who wore a sombrero, blasted rancheras from his speakers, and bought entire towns in Veracruz and Puebla. Not for style, not for disguise, but because he understood something vital. To rule Colombia's future, you had to own Mexico's present. He funded paramilitary groups across the region, trained men in jungle camps with military advisors, bought RPGs, grenades, .50 caliber rifles, and stored them across the Mexican countryside. Because Gacha didn't just want to move product. He wanted a backup country, a second home, a second front. If Colombia burned, he'd still have a kingdom north of the border. This wasn't drug trafficking anymore. This was transnational warfare. And El Mexicano was no longer a nickname. It was a flag, a brand, and for some, a curse. Power changes a man, but absolute power? It unravels him. By the late 1980s, José Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha wasn't just rich. He was untouchable. Planes, ranches, private armies. He moved between countries like a ghost in a tailored suit. But with that power came a new obsession: control. And control requires one thing above all else: eliminating uncertainty. So he started seeing enemies everywhere, in rivals, in friends, in shadows. He no longer trusted the Colombians. He no longer trusted the Mexicans. He barely trusted his own men. So he started buying silence the only way he knew how: with death. Anyone who whispered his name was marked. Anyone who questioned an order vanished. Entire villages were burned to send a message to one man. And as the paranoia grew, so did the firepower. Gacha wasn't arming a cartel anymore. He was building an army. He imported Israeli mercenaries to train his killers, brought in rocket launchers, C4, long-range sniper rifles. He stocked weapons in dozens of bunkers across Colombia and Mexico, not just for defense, but for something bigger. Some say he was preparing for an all-out war with the Colombian state. Others say he was preparing for Pablo Escobar, because the truth was, Medellin was cracking from the inside. Too much blood, too much heat, too many egos under one roof. And Gacha, he wasn't built to serve anyone. Not Escobar, not the cartel, not God.